It's my pleasure to interview Dr. Charlie McLaughlin, who's had a key role in the history of the University of Nebraska College of Medicine. As we were discussing, he mentioned he's been on campus since 1935. But Dr. McLaughlin, I think I'll start with, where did you get your training initially?
What was the question?
Where did you get your training initially? You mentioned University of Iowa.
I had my liberal arts education at Iowa and took my first 2 years of medicine there. And then they had one of their periodic disruptions in the medical school faculty. And while I had intended to graduate there, because my father had in '96 from that institution, we discussed it, and he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Either Harvard or Washington." And he said, "Well, try it." And Washington took me on 12 hours notice to make up a course, which meant running the laboratory during the month of August with the temperature at 106 while everybody took a vacation. And at the end of August, they told me I had made up the course and I was in the junior class.
That's at Washington University,
Washington University, St. Louis. Graduated there in '29, went to McGill and took an internship there at the Montreal General Hospital under McGill University. Stayed on a second year as a resident in pathology under Lawrence Ray. Then was fortunate to get a fellowship in surgery at the University of Pennsylvania for 3 years. Went down there under Dr. Eldridge Lassen and finished there in 34. And then had a traveling fellowship at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland with Sir David Wilkie. When my money ran out there, because there was no money available then, I searched for a place to go with a medical school in the Midwest. And I knew one person in Omaha, and I thought, well, that's a good place to start, and ended up here in January, a bitterly cold day, 1935.
Came to the medical school. Who was dean at that time?
The dean at that time, of course, was Dean Pointer. And the head of surgery was Dr. Keegan, to whom I had written a note and asked him if there was a possibility of getting on the surgical department. And he assured me that if I came out, he would certainly find a spot for me. So I did move to Omaha and was first introduced to the medical school on the bitterly cold days of January '35.
Very good.
School then consisted of a very beautiful front yard, which was cared for by an English gardener, long since gone, both the yard and the gardener, the north building and the south building, and 2 units of the university hospital. And that was all. Behind the university hospital was a cinder parking lot, which would accommodate about 20 automobiles. It was never filled. There weren't that many there. And behind that, about 4 acres of playing field, which I never saw used. That extended back to the children's hospital in the pre-war days. We had about 50 beds on general surgery at that time. They were under the general direction of 5 chiefs, of whom were Dr. Alfred Brown, Dr. Chester Waters, Dr. Charlie Rich, Dr. John Nilsson, and one other I'll think of in just a moment.
So they ran the 5 services.
No, they rotated on being chief of service.
Okay.
John Kennedy, Charlie Kennedy was the 5th. And they would take the service, each of the services, for about 2 months as the titular head of the service. They made rounds perhaps once a week, but they were on call. The actual work on the wards was done by junior surgeons, of whom at that time there were really only 3 of us. There was Dewey Bisgard and Fred Hicken and myself. And Hicken was with Russ Best, and they were doing some surgery, and Dewey was doing some work for his brother over in Harlan, Iowa. And I had nobody, so I worked out here 4 to 5 mornings a week on the surgical staff. Tremendous amount of work. One forgets that at that time, the counties in the state of Nebraska could send any indigent, quote, patient into the university hospital in their quota, which was generous. And I think they only paid $4.50 a day for them at the university hospital. So we had a glut of beautiful surgical material, most all of it advanced. We had a full ward of thyroids because nobody would touch those outstate. We had a great number of biliary problems because nobody wanted to touch those. Peripheral vascular things were transferred, and of course malignancy of all kinds. It was a dream for a young trained surgeon, except we didn't have very good assistant help because there were only 12 interns, and you did all of this work with a single intern as an assistant who had never seen any of the procedures until you showed him the first one. It was quite an experience.
So you became actively involved in the 30s.
Operate for about 4 days a week, do 3 or 4 cases every morning, make rounds on them, for which we received absolutely nothing. There was no compensation whatsoever in the 5 or 10 years that I did this. We never even got a note of thanks from the governor, except one governor thought our wages should be reduced to save money in the state until he found out that there were no salaries, which was a little aside in history.
So you had a private practice then?
A large private practice, charitable.
Very good.
And then occasionally you would see a small case for which you might get a fee outside. But it was very slow in those Depression days. Business was very, very tight. The senior men were hanging on to everything that they could get. And I think in my first year, after 5.5 years of training, I grossed just a little over $2,000. It's hard for one to believe that today.
Yes,
the next year was about twice that. And it took about 7 years to become really solvent in that time.
Who were your colleagues in other departments here? For example, in medicine?
Rich Young was in neurology. John Sharp was in internal medicine. Petey Adams came on in urology, and then later Henry Commandel joined him. Maine Anderson was reading the electrocardiograms. Bennett was in neurology along with G. Alec Young, the senior, who were running that department. I can't, the basic science people I knew only socially because I had never had any contact with them as a student.
Was Dr. Hunt in radiology?
Dr. Hunt was head of radiology and was a very close friend, and I had early established a clinical affiliation with the Methodist Hospital, and so Howard and I became very good friends early on. That is in the pre-war years. I'm talking about that era from 1935 to 1942. And this ran along that way for about 7 years with almost no change until the time that we entered the war.
That's right. Now, with the war and therein, actually, there was a change then in the dean. Dr. Portner retired.
Dr. Pointer was still here when the war was declared. Augie Jonas had come on the staff, but Augie was single, and so Augie went in the service early. About the first year of the war, I went to see the dean and asked to be released. I was on an essential list, and so draft couldn't touch me. And I said I wanted to enlist. He said, no way. And he tossed me out of the office. He said, you're carrying too heavy a teaching load. And I was carrying a heavy load. So I waited for about 2 weeks and went back to see him again. And I said, this war is getting hot. I've got to get in him. I was then almost 37. And he said, no way. We've got to keep people that are good teachers and will stay here. And I went back a third time to him and said, Dr. Pointer, I want to ask you just one question. I said, You can't tell me any conceivable way that we can win this war as of right now. And if you were in my place, wouldn't you want to be in it and have a little teeny part in maybe trying to win it? This is in 42, and nobody could see it. He said, you win. And he picked up the phone and called Roy Fouts, and he said, I got a fellow that insists on enlisting. I said, I'm going in the Navy this afternoon. And Phil Redrick and I went down. We were duck hunters together. So I took Phil down with me because Phil was colorblind. And the Navy's a little fussy on that, so I memorized the charts and went in first. And Phil passed all right. And we both got in the same time. And he was sent to Farragut, and I was sent to Great Lakes. That was in the November of 42. Mm-hmm. So we were away from the campus. I didn't get back until 46. And Phil likewise was away. And it was during that time that they had established the student ROTC and the Navy and so forth, and they drilled out here. When we came back, came right back over to the university again. The older men were getting older, and they were tired. Brown and Nielsen and Rich and Kennedy and Herb Davis had become older. Russ Best had become older. Dewey Bisgard was older. They were all 10 years my senior, every one of them. And so a grouping of 4 was created in the surgical department. We were all made professors of surgery, and we operated as a group of 4, but Herb was the chairman. And that was in 1948. Now, prior to that, we got in the great residency deal. And about late 46, we had a great meeting in the amphitheater, the old amphitheater. And I had established a Type 2 3-year surgical residency at the Methodist as soon as I got home, because I realized, as did everybody that had had his training, that no other state was going to take Nebraska boys to train them. They're going to take their own boys. And after all, there were 10 million men, 11 million men, 13 million men coming home from the service. So I thought we ought to establish some residency programs. There were none. We got a Type 2 3-year program established at the Methodist, and John Brush and Bob Cochran were 2 of the first residents in that thing. But then we talked about it, and I thought the universities ought to be the center for this. It is the teaching center. So we had a great staff meeting. And I happened to be the ringleader of the proposal to have a Type 1 teaching residency at the university. And it was an extremely stormy session. I can remember 3 or 4 of the senior men who I shan't mention because they were well-intentioned. But it was a great change from their whole background and philosophy. They were extremely bitter at the thought that an intern wasn't as highly a trained person as you ever needed around the hospital. But there were just enough young men who agreed with me so that we put it to a vote and we won it. And we applied for a Type 1 residency, got it accepted immediately, and we closed our residency at the Methodist the next day and transferred Brush and Cochran over to the university, and they were the first residents to graduate in the surgical program here. Herb Davis, at that time, being the acting chairman.
So that's the rise of really modern residency programs right after the war,
right,
as far as types and numbers.
Herb was then retained the chairmanship until 1958, at which time Jim Musselman was solicited as the first full-time chairman. Remember, there were almost no full-time clinical people prior to 58, and this was a great step in that direction.
I recall those times because your history now is coming with my history.
This is where we moved into that.
That's right.
Up from the end of the war in 45, 46 to 58, we rotated on the service. Russ, Dewey, Herb, and I. carrying the load on it. But we had residents at that time. And so we would supervise them and carry our responsibility as the chiefs on the service. But we started the residency program, and it flourished.
You mentioned, let me go back a moment, you come under Pointer. Then after Pointer, actually there was a period of change again at that point, right after the war.
Yes.
And Dr. Lutz was here. Then Dr. Tolman.
Yes.
A number of people have commented about Pointer and also about Tolman. Few have commented very much about Lutz. Would you comment about Dean Lutz, your experiences?
Dean Lutz followed Dr. Pointer, and Dr. Pointer, those who remember him know that he was the medical school at that time. He lived in an era when that was possible. It would never be possible today. It wasn't true in many schools at that time. But Dr. Pointer was the medical school. He decided who would be admitted. He decided who would be released prior to graduation. He decided who would graduate. He decided where you would intern. And he did this with fairness, sometimes not always interpreted that way, but he met fairly. Mm-hmm. He was absolutely the czar in the medical school. He entertained all the young staff people at those buckwheat Sunday morning breakfasts in rotation, which were a means of getting the faculty to know each other.
Buckwheat?
Buckwheat cake breakfast. Mrs. Pointer had a colored cook named Maryland, I think, who could make wonderful buckwheat cakes, pancakes,
yes.
Buckwheat. And a tradition during those early years were the Sunday morning buckwheat breakfasts at the Pointer home, to which maybe 8 or 10 couples would be invited, always young staff people mm-hmm. with their wives. And they were get-togethers, but it was the way Dr. Pointer was able to evaluate his young staff people. And he did a very creditable job of this, and Mrs. Pointer was a very good helpmeet in carrying that along with him.
The buckwheat assessment, is that
well,
they would assess the people.
That is a typical Midwest dish, as yes, you may or may not know. And most people like them, some don't, but they ate them. Then Dr. Luth followed the Pointer era. Dr. Luth was a Chicago product. I think a very well-trained internist. He came right out of the war as a full chicken colonel. Rank was a difficult thing for some people to drop easily at the end of a war. And I say that in all fairness, mm-hmm. particularly those to whose personalities it fit well. He tried very hard to introduce certain changes in the medical school. I thought he was always fair, sometimes totally undiplomatic. Mm-hmm. I don't think he ever realized his problem in following a man who had the complete sympathy, the trust, almost not only the respect, but the abject affection of so many people. And were he St. Paul, I don't think he could have succeeded. And so he had problems. After all, too, people were more critical after the war. They'd all been moved around a lot. Mm-hmm. They had been different places. They had dealt with people from other schools. So his was a rather stormy period.
After him came Tolman.
Terry Tolman came after him.
Then you were also here for the Whitson era?
I was also here for the Whitson era. Perry was a healer. Under his tutelage, things were much more quiet. He was able to arbitrate things very, very much more quietly, mm-hmm. and I thought did a very good job of making everybody work together pretty well in the common interests of the school. It was a growing period. We were trying to get our feet on the ground, and everything was ripe when Dr. Whitson came along. And of course, Cecil had a God-given ability to promote, and I say that with the greatest respect, because promotion is a talent, and he had it in abundance. He was not only a very capable psychiatrist, and as I understand it, completely revolutionized the basic concept of psychiatry in our state and the management of its institutions. And I don't want to go into that because I'm no authority on it, but from what I saw and read, this seemed to be true. But when he came to the deanship, in his quiet way, and by a wide acquaintance and the ability to use that acquaintance, he was able to construct and do things that nobody else with local background could ever have accomplished. He was a builder. And I think his everlasting memorial will be this campus which we have here.
Right. Coming on campus in 35, you've lived through a number of eras. You've also been very active in the American Surgical, as far as the National Association. You've also been very involved in community affairs, King of Exarban. How do you put it all together? How have you put it all together?
Well, I think that one can't just be a professional person alone. It would be very easy to do that and commit all your spare time to golf or hunting, which I happen to like, or writing or doing something. But I think one has to do some of everything. I think you have to do things in the community, else you'll be accused of never having participated at all. I think you must do something in your profession, and I very much resent the statement that some of my younger colleagues make, that the literature is too full, I don't want to add anything to it. There's no age-old theorem that the person who learns the most from writing an article is he who writes it. And that is a very good excuse, if for no other reason, to write and to keep writing, because it makes you review the literature, it makes you review your own experience, it makes you question the writings of others. It makes you see that there is something that you may contribute along the way. But it all takes time and it takes effort. And unfortunately, if you don't do that, it does not permit you to become one of the members of the national societies, which doesn't make you any dollars, but it does give you the great satisfaction of knowing your colleagues all over this country and abroad, which is a source of satisfaction to anybody. I feel very strongly about that.
You should also feel very honored. I mean that sincerely.
I think it's quite worth the effort. And I think that the schools should push that. I think those who teach should push that. I've tried to push it always with young people, to stress its importance for only one reason, for what it will do for you.
Currently, you're working with the Nebraska Methodist Foundation.
That's right.
May I ask how old you are?
I'm 77.
What do you plan to do?
Oh, keep active, keep working. I'm engaged in something that fascinates me now. The foundation is fundamentally to raise money, you know that. But we have just almost completed funding our nursing scholarship program with $1 million. My principal interest right now is our adolescent drug alcohol program over at Midtown. We're prejudiced, but we think we have the best one in the whole area. We have 42 beds there in that, with a big outpatient department, for which the Kiewit Foundation has just given us $1 million, which I must match and hope to. But this is a real challenge today. It's a far cry from surgery, but it's still taking care of people, and people are sorely needed.
It's in your pattern of helping people and the communities people live in.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLaughlin.